I'm not a huge competitor, but I like doing it some. I like having that option and knowing that there's not really an adequate place for me. It certainly kind of blows. And that's ultimately what trans women in sports feel, what their motivation is behind wanting to compete in women's sports.
Hey everyone, today we've got Erin Wedekind on the podcast, and I think this is going to be really interesting. I think it's going to be very topical, and I think the place that we need to start with is your origin story. Talk about jiu-jitsu and talk about some of the big changes in your life while you were doing jiu-jitsu or possibly pre-existing that.
Yeah, so I started training in, I want to say 2011 or so. I started teaching classes, helping my coach pretty quickly after that at white belt. In about, at the start of 2016, my coach ended up moving back to his home state of Florida, and that's why I took over the gym from him, and I've been running it ever since. I've been pretty much eating, sleeping, and breathing jiu-jitsu, though I've never been a world beater myself, but if someone tells you I suck, they're probably lying. But
now your school is in Appleton, Wisconsin.
That's right.
And it's got the strange title. Like you in your Instagram and on your website, you make a special emphasis saying that it's an inclusive school, which I think is should be the case everywhere, but is certainly not. What do you mean by inclusive?
I mean exactly what people are going to assume it means when they read it. That I try my best to make it as accommodating to as wide a range of people as I can, in part because of my own personal situation. That kind of helps clarify the necessity of that. Mm-hmm. And in part because it just feels like the right thing to focus on.
Okay. So what do you do different? I mean, or is it just a lack of things that you do? I mean, certainly a lot of jiu-jitsu schools are pretty right-wing these days. I mean, for lack of a better word, to use a very broad cudgel that doesn't begin to express the nuances and the different shades of belief that are out there, right? This, you're either left or you're right is super, super simplistic and doesn't do it justice. But I think a lot of the right-wing schools would typically drive off, people on the LGBT spectrum, either intentionally or inadvertently.
Yeah. And that's definitely one thing that I try to keep in mind whenever I'm making decisions regarding my gym, is that I have to remember that I don't really know what all the different kinds of people are like. I've only experienced life through 0.0 repeating % of all possible human permutations. So, if I, for example, when I handling the way I do belt promotions, I do them in exactly the way that everybody hates and is sure is the very worst way to do it. And that is attendance.
Oh.
Attendance, because it's objective and numerical, so I can't inject my own opinion into that. And when everyone says that, when everyone says that their belts or whatever, that they have a consistent standard, but that a standard needs to be applied differently to different people, for example, people with disabilities. Well, that isn't a very consistent standard then. By just keeping track of attendance, that's something that I can, in fact, apply consistently to everybody. Are they training? And if somebody gets to blue belt and they're not very good, well, that's on me, isn't it? They're showing up, they're doing my classes. If I'm doing my job right, they should be making some improvements. If they aren't, I need to reevaluate how I'm doing stuff. And what's more, if you're doing by handling belt promotions on, well, attendance, I also count competition participation as credit as well.
What about participation performance? Or sorry, competition performance. If I go and I
Yeah.
lose my entire division versus I sweep the division and I fight a weight division up and I murder everybody in there, does that have any bearing?
If you come to a class, that's 1 credit. If you go to a tournament, you get a credit for each division you enter. You get a credit for each match you do. You get a credit for each win. And you get a credit for each submission. So that if you go to a tournament, wreck ass, you're going to get promoted pretty quickly, in part to get you the hell out of the beginner divisions. Right? Open that up for people who actually need that handicapped division. Yeah, I encourage competition. I love it. But if you're not competing, there's also a place for those people to be promoted as well. And a bit slower, not a whole lot. But when you look at any given gym, and you look at especially blue belts, what you're going to see is a pretty wide disparity in actual ability. Right? They're all going to fall on a pretty wide bell curve. You go to a gym where there's some absolute killers at a particular belt rank, I assure you, if it's a gym of any reasonable size, there will be people at that same rank who kind of suck ass. And the worst case scenario in running promotions based on attendance is that you're going to end up with some people who kind of suck ass. And that's already the baseline. So
right. Yeah. I mean, this whole biasing it towards the super athlete, the guy who wrestled for 5 years in college or is a judo black belt and now is competing in the white belt division. I mean, that's always a tricky issue in terms of, how do we do this fairly? So maybe just number of classes is certainly, plus number of competitions is a way to get around that. And it's something I've got a strong opinion on either way, but it's very interesting to hear your rationale for it. Let's transition to your story.
Well, there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff to discuss there.
Okay.
I've had the, pretty typical late in life transition experience. I had this underlying problem that was always very hard to really describe or put my finger on for about as long as I can remember. And it wasn't until sometime in middle school that I actually, mentally articulated the specific thought of, I would have been better off not being born a boy. And at the time, given the complete 100% lack of any kind of LGBT discussion in education, I just chalked it up to, sucks to be me, and carried on.
You probably didn't even know that there was a term for this, and the whole vocabulary around that issue is, and you can't really think about things without a vocabulary.
Exactly. Which is why some of these current laws here in the U.S. are a bit troubling. Because they're trying to find that exact sort of scenario for a whole lot of people. But as time went on, these issues became a little more pervasive. And in college, that's when I started to actually encounter, not necessarily at school, but just at that time of my life and that time in public discourse, discussions about LGBT people and transgender people in specific. And at that time, the impression that was really burned into me is that these people are freaks. They're delusional. They're trying to pursue some kind of fantasy that they should absolutely give up on. And I internalized that pretty hard and tried very hard to uh, be normal. But yeah, that didn't work out too well.
Hmm.
And I started to really consider whether or not taking some kind of actionable steps was the right path for me in about 2015. But that's about the same time that the whole transition with this gym started to take place. And, you know, jujitsu is just an absolute obsession of mine. So I kind of tabled it, what I assumed to be permanently for that purpose, for jujitsu. And it's basically having a lot more time to myself over the course of the pandemic and some tangentially related medical issues in, well, at the start of the pandemic as well, testicular cancer.
Oh,
That started to actually really confirm for me uh, that no, a transition might actually be the right path forward. And over the course of just the past year, I finally finally decided that, I'm 35 now. Even though a transition might suck, so has not. And I've already gone the first
hmm.
half of my life trying that one option, so here I am.
Okay. Well, there are so many places that we could go with this, but let's just get a bit more background in terms of feeling that something was off and having internalized those stereotypes about trans. They're just all essential attention-seeking, uh, attention-seeking mentally ill people. How were you raised? Were you like raised religious or in a very religious
Oh,
atmosphere?
that's a little bit complicated because when I was very young, my family was very a-religious. Despite the German name, most of my family is Mexican on both sides.
Okay.
Uh, so the general prevailing uh, religious attitude was Catholic. Uh,
Hmm.
my grandmother and my aunts and such on my mom's side were are pretty devout Catholics. My mom, pretty ambivalent for the first chunk of my life. My dad as well, and he eventually abandoned any just underlying notions of religiosity since then. But my mom became pretty religious when I was in high school, and it was actually some experiences at a evangelical church that first really opened my eyes to what kind of uh, atmosphere LGBT people are just inundated in, right? How awkward is it to be uh, me, and having already sort of identified what my internal issues were while sitting there in a youth group, a pray the gay away session.
Had
So,
you been identified as was it like a prophylactic pray the gay away vaccination session, or did you actually get
uh,
targeted for conversion therapy at some point?
no, it was regarding a another kid
Oh God.
in the youth group who was openly gay, and they were nice to him, but they just did not realize how being kind to and supportive of someone uh, is pretty contradictory to refusing to accept or legitimize some pretty fundamental and intrinsic parts of themselves.
Okay. So you were like, screw this, I'm not drawing any attention to myself on this front, otherwise I'll be at the center of this intervention.
Yes, yes. Intervention
Okay.
is maybe the best way to frame that kind of a approach.
Okay. Uh, so let's kind of jump into some of the stereotypes that you hear people throw out when they talk about trans people.
Well, instead of going over those stereotypes and rehashing things that everyone has already pretty well internalized, I think what's missing from the conversation is who and what transgender people are and what our motivations actually are. Because even a lot of support for transgender people comes in the form of a sort of almost libertarian personal liberty angle of,
How do you
you
mean?
know, people should be allowed to, live their life as they choose. And often leaving room for caveats of, but don't expect us to accommodate that, right?
Okay.
With the same approach that a libertarian might support owning a pet kangaroo. But it's far deeper and more intrinsic than that, and far more relatable to the cisgender experience than most people would realize. Because a transgender person's perspective of their gender, or at the very least, most of our importance that we place on our gender identities, is really not so different from the importance that cis people place on their gender identities, which is also incredibly valid. It's why boys and men spend so much time teasing each other about being girls. Right? In much the same way that I've never had to really be aware of my kidneys and how they function for my body. It sounds like have.
Yeah, I've had a very definite reason to worry about my kidneys and become deeply in tune with their function.
And even hearing people describe the symptoms of kidney failure, of course, there's a part of me that, because I've never really experienced that, going, I've been sick before. I've been tired before. Surely I get it. I don't, though. I just have no basis for understanding that experience. In much the same way that a cisgender person, like presumably yourself, just has no reason to really confront their gender and how they fit into it or how it fits into the world. Right? When you're a cisgender, especially a cisgender man, especially a manly cisgender man,
and white.
That's never going to hurt. There's just no reason to ever have to think about your gender critically. You've never had it challenged or called into question, other than,
jokingly,
as just
but it's not seriously,
or random meaningless teasing, that kind of thing. Never where you actually have to sit down and question where you belong or have been told that you don't belong at all. And the other thing that people don't understand is that not only is it much more internally important than people would tend to give it credit for, it's also a lot more normal and natural than people would expect.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when we say things
I
like,
mean, not that something has to have antecedents in other societies for it to be valid, but it helps in the argument and in people wrapping their heads around it.
Yeah. So at the broader level, the concept of transgender as we know it in society today really is exclusive to a lot of facets of modern culture. If we went to a different parallel universe where gender norms and expectations had evolved totally different in our social history, the concept of a transgender person might not even exist. There certainly are and have been cultures that include something that we would consider to be a gender model that includes more than two genders, right? Male, female, and neither or in between. Masculine men, feminine versus feminine men versus masculine women versus feminine women. There have also been and continue to be cultures that allow different degrees of self-determination when it comes to gender placement in society,
Or
and different
switching.
degrees of exactly, and different degrees of mobility in between them.
I
So
thought it was an Eastern European culture where, like, if the head of the household, the male head of the household dies, I want to say Georgia or Armenia, it was someplace like there where the oldest woman basically has the option to transition and be, do all the male things, dress like a man, do all the things that only men are allowed to do. I think they have to
yeah,
give up sex. Am I making this up?
no, or we heard it from the same person that's making it up, but no,
Okay.
I think you're right about that. I don't remember the exact geography either, but yeah, the way that we structure gender in our society isn't the only way to do it. It isn't some law of the universe that it must be this way. And the fact that we have a binary gender system, which is very broadly encompassing. It includes damn near everything, right? Colors are gendered. Jobs. For some reason, we've decided that girls wear skirts and guys wear pants, despite the fact that men have worn something like a skirt more than pants throughout all of history. Uh, they all have historical reasons for those trends coming into play, but they aren't intrinsic to human nature. So, yeah, when you have a binary gender structure that's uh, broadly encompassing, strictly enforced, and very rigid, it would be pretty shocking if that had a 100% success rate. So, for example, the idea of the typical binary transgender person, male to female or female to male, our issue is usually not so much with the boxes that were presented to us, but more with the fact that someone else got to choose for us and picked poorly. For other people, the issue is the particular boxes that are drawn, right? How our male and female genders are categorized, such that our, 21st century Western idea of man and woman just don't adequately apply to some people. And those are largely your non-binary people,
Right.
who, again, their gender identity is as important to them as ours is to you and I. And that's one that I personally don't really understand or relate to. But I'm still going to take their fucking word for it,
So you and I, Erin, started talking about this a little bit in the context of the wedge issue of trans women in elite level sport. And Joe Sixpack on the street is quite likely to say stuff like, well, screw it, I'm going to transition tonight, and then tomorrow I'm going to go enter a women's softball tournament, and I'm just going to crush everybody, and then I'm going to be in the Olympic team, next month. And this idea that transitioning and as an athlete is this easy thing to do with no consequences other than performing much better. And so I don't think those people have even the slightest bit of understanding of what's involved in transitioning, be it hormone replacement therapy and the other things. Can you talk a little bit about your transitioning process? How far in are you, and what have you done that has an effect on your athletic ability?
Well, I mean, first off, to those people, really simple rebuttal. Go ahead, open up. But for me, I don't want to get into too much detail, just because I want to be careful about how many bullets I'm loading into other people's guns.
Sure.
But for starters, I'm not an elite athlete. I am a hobbyist level athlete, an amateur. So it's really hard to say how my performance has really diminished, especially since I know I look pretty beef on camera, but I'm about as of last night, I was about 127 pounds.
The camera adds 40 pounds.
Yeah. So the fact that everybody I roll with has a good, 40 to 80 pounds on me pretty consistently means that business as usual.
Okay.
But in terms of competing against people in my weight class, I felt a bit of a difference, and I think that's where some of the science is represented pretty dishonestly, because on the one hand, there hasn't been a whole lot of research into the specific athletic performance effects of testosterone suppression, especially at high levels, because how crazy do you have to be a high-level athlete and be deliberately suppressing testosterone? Most of them are trying to get away with injecting it.
Yeah.
But
especially in jiu-jitsu. My God.
Yeah. Yeah, or no one's even trying to stop you. But what research there has been done, I know the first really significant paper was published in maybe just 2016. So it is fairly understudied, but the conclusions that have been reached thus far are that there is a significant performance impact. How much there is varies pretty wildly from individual to individual.
A pretty significant performance impact of testosterone suppression therapy.
Correct.
So just for people, I mean, we've got to assume that people know nothing about it, and I know barely anything about it. Are you, or is the typical, if you want to speak for all male to female trans people everywhere of all time, I know that's a heavy load to bear. Typically, would it be as simple as taking estrogen, but there are other drugs as well to suppress testosterone? What are people typically taking?
So most trans women, especially binary trans women, and take some kind of estrogen, either oral or a patch or an injection, and mostly alongside a testosterone suppressor. Usually in the U.S., that's spironolactone. If you're lucky, you can also get some better medications for testosterone suppression, like bicalutamide. But most trans women who have access to these medications do choose to take them, not because some athletic commission insists that they do, but because of the physical effects on our bodies.
Okay. So to drag this, I mean, edge cases make poor law, and to go but the poster boy or poster girl that's forever being brought up on, say, Fox News is Leah Thomas, the male to female athlete who was, middle of the pack, elite level swimmer as a male, and then was just crushing cis women as a trans woman.
That's how they report it, yeah.
So, but I think we have to address this one specific issue, or this one specific example, because it's just brought up again and again and again. It's kind of like a mic drop moment. Yeah, but here. And that's all they really have to say. And then what about the argument that, well, she's just going to stop taking her testosterone suppression medication and she's going to be naturally doping? As if the other swimmers aren't doping every way that they possibly can as well.
Of course. Yes. And for trans women fortunate enough to have access to feminizing hormone therapy, they don't give that up lightly. You're going to pry our estrogen from our cold, dead hands. Of course, when you get to an elite level of athletics, people's motivations do shift pretty heavily toward their competitions, of course. So let's look at Lia Thomas crushing her opponents after being a supposedly unremarkable swimmer in the men's division. No, she was in well above average for D1 swimmers competing in the men's divisions. And she began her medical transition as her swimming career was reaching its peak, when most of her colleagues were still on the upswing at the peak of some of their athletic development, especially as it relates to testosterone-driven muscle building. And when she won a championship, she was the first out of hundreds, at least, over the past couple of decades, because, well, trans women have been competing at high-level international athletics for a good 20 years now. Mm-hmm. There isn't exactly a list, but presently the best estimates put the population of trans women in the NCAA at about 50 active competitors. So you're talking at least hundreds over the course of the past couple of decades. And they've managed one championship in one event, in one sport. Yeah. And Thomas competed in 4 events of the 18 held that day. Won one of them. Good job, Leah. And it took last in another one. So what about all those cis women who have beaten her throughout her career, which is quite a few? And no, she didn't actually set any new records or anything. She performed well and won. And this whole fixation on Lia Thomas, the only one who has ever won a D1 championship, already belies the point that trans women's inclusion is predicated on them losing. If we are being fair to both trans and cis women, they should both be permitted to win. And when you look at how the conversation around their performance has shifted, especially from like the Joe Rogans et al. Over the years, and I'm going to keep picking on him, but, he's picked on me a lot, and turnabout's fair play. So when you look at how the Rogans and the like have talked about transgender women in sports over the years, you'll notice how the conversation has shifted. It was previously a concern about trans women dominating women's sports. And now that discussion is mostly around very specific nuances of of biochemistry related to testosterone suppression, and hypothetical assumptions about how previous training affects your ability to train in the future. It gets pretty hazy the farther down you go. And that's a lot like trying to describe a map of the forest by putting a leaf under a microscope. They keep saying that, there's no data about it, but there is, right? If you want to know, do trans women dominate cis women in sports, or do they displace cis women in sports? Well, the data you've got to look at is, fucking do they?
Yeah. I assume that if in the future, 5 years from now, this vast conspiracy of cis men who just want to win a medal, and they all decide to do a fake transition, and they just decide to, and they end up winning half of the medals in, I don't know, in the Olympics or in the Pan Am Games, then we've got a problem. But we don't have that problem.
Do we? So,
well, then it comes to the issue of fairness to the cis women.
Does it? We'll circle back around to that. We'll get there.
Okay.
Let's stick a pin in that and remember to come back to it. Because when we look at the answer to the question, does trans inclusion in women's sports affect the competitive landscape of those sports? No, because like I said, trans women have been competing at high-level women's sports for decades now, and thus far have, male to female trans women have never won an Olympic championship, for example. But what about Quinn? Quinn is not a male to female trans woman. They're a female to non-binary. So that doesn't support their conclusions very well. But when we look at other areas where people have natural advantages going into a sport, we can look at, let's say, left-handed people in boxing. And there's long been a rumor that left-handed people have a natural advantage in boxing, right? I'm sure you've heard that plenty. Yeah. And how might we find out if they actually do? Well, we could look at their representation in professional boxing relative to their representation in the population at large. And left-handed people make up about 10% of the population, and they make up about 17% of pro boxers. So that means they're overrepresented in boxing by about 70%. So yeah, left-handedness is at least appears to be a pretty big advantage in boxing. Now, we can, again, come back to whether or not that means left-handed people should be barred from competing in women's boxing because they are coming in with an unfair advantage. But we can also look at that, or we can apply that same criterion to trans women, right? This is where the numbers get a little harder to estimate because people are far more willing to be put on a list of left-handed people than they are to be put on a list of trans people for some historical reasons. But the best estimates put the transgender population in North America at somewhere between 0.3% to a little under 1%. In that ballpark is probably where we're looking. Again, there's no official list of trans athletes in the NCAA, but the best numbers I could find for an estimate place at about 50 active competitors in the NCAA. And let's assume that all of those are trans women. So, well, how many NCAA athletes were there. Right? In 2020, the most recent numbers I could find, 222,000. So 50 people out of 222,000 is 0.02%. So we're going from 0.3% of the general population to 0.02% of collegiate athletes. That means they're underrepresented by an entire order of magnitude. So that would somewhat suggest a disadvantage for trans women, wouldn't it? Which probably more selective than a disadvantage, but what people never talk about, because we're so fixated on the minutia of endocrinology, because that's way harder for us to answer, we also always forget that, especially a medical gender transition comes with a lot of disadvantages beyond just the medications themselves, although the side effects from them, especially spironolactone, can themselves be a little bit problematic for an athletic career. There's also all of the stress involved, all of the pressure to leave the sport. As you begin to move to a higher level and get more notice, you're certainly dealing with a lot of hate and harassment. There's all of at least here in the States, a whole lot of phone calls with your insurance company, it turns out. And like a comprehensive medical transition is like taking on a part-time job. Yeah. So no, I don't think that underrepresentation in collegiate sports necessarily implies a disadvantage to trans women in the terms of athletic performance. It does pretty directly and clearly imply a disadvantage in participation, at least.
That I'll grant. I could just hear some of the people who are listening to this who listened to us 2 minutes ago versus now that you've clarified it, getting their panties in a twist.
Yeah, and again, we can look at the outcomes, because we can argue about how the ratio of your jawbone to your neck affects your ability to take a punch. Although when we apply that same logic to cis women, we also find those same advantages and disadvantages at play there. Cisgender people have quite a broad range of physical attributes, including, I might add, in the past, the Olympics in particular has tried a lot of different methods to define what constitutes a woman for their female competitions, and they've all been pretty disastrous. It started with physical examinations, which are obviously pretty invasive and needlessly disqualify intersex people, which is someone born with genitals that are not distinctly male or female, or have such an appearance when they're born that the doctor confuses one for the other. They've tried karyotyping, which again discriminates against intersex people, including cis women with androgen insensitivity. So in other words, there are, in fact, cisgender women who were born with Y chromosomes.
Right. But their body just doesn't respond to the testosterone that's in the system.
And never has. And if you don't karyotype, meaning you don't look at your chromosomes under a microscope to determine whether you have an X or a Y or how many chromosomes you have in total, you would never know. There are all kinds of permutations of karyotype and genetics as it relates to sexual development.
Yeah, I find the refusal to acknowledge the existence of intersex people. There's only men and women. And what about
even like, biologically?
Yeah,
It's
even
more complicated.
in air quotes, biologically, there are people that if you look at them, you don't know, or yeah, it's a bit of column A, bit of column B, and it kind of destroys this. There's only men or women argument. Now, I've just started digging. Physiology is not my area of expertise. When I was doing my degrees in biology, I focused much more on microbiology and statistics and experimental methods and stuff like that. So digging into the literature, the scientific literature around the trans athletes is difficult because there's obviously such deeply held beliefs, and if you cherry pick hard enough, you can come up with whatever conclusion you like. But it really does seem, based off my sort of first cruise through the science, that many of the advantages that men, biologically cis men, have go away after hormone replacement therapy, and you're left with things like bone density, which decreases over time, a little bit of increased height, because on average, men are taller than women, and that the real sort of gorilla in the room is testosterone for most things that we care about in a sport context. You know, that
Yeah, and I don't. We can. Yeah, and Rogan will be happy to bring up the fact that perhaps bone density diminishes slowly or doesn't diminish at all. I can't say I've ever been tapped out and gone, damn, that guy's got really dense bones.
yeah.
And when we're looking at all that minutia, what we have to be asking is, does this translate into performance?
Yeah.
Because, I mean,
it's easy to create a bunch of just so stories saying, well, the angle of the femur relative to the hip, the Q angle is this in men and it's that in women, and this doesn't get changed. And then when you go and look at it, there's very few sports in which that Q angle actually makes a difference. And yes, trans women are taller on average than cis women. And in some sports, that might be a little bit. I'll grant you that might be a little bit of an advantage in some sports.
A bit, but in sports where height is an advantage, average height women don't make the cut.
Yep.
Right? The average Olympic women's volleyball player is considerably taller than the average man. If you threw in a trans woman into Olympic volleyball competition, their height advantage, or their supposed height advantage, would wash out in the fact that they are in a pool of outliers.
So what about the red herring argument there? It's like, what if a 6'8" man decides to transition, and now you've got a 6'8" man pretending to be a woman? I'm speaking in the redneck tone. On the women's Olympic basketball team, and now you've got a 6'8" member of the team, and this is clearly unfair. Like, that is the
great.
It hasn't happened.
They will be able to look. They will be able to look some of their tallest colleagues directly in the eye, because that is how tall some of the tallest women in like basketball and volleyball are. We are talking about 6'8".
Okay. So if performance is the variable that we need to look at, as opposed to some esoteric difference in lung volume or vascularization among untrained trans women, or, like, we can always find some variable that we can then create a just so story around. If performance is the real variable, then can you go into why it's not unfair? Assuming that there is a difference in performance, why wouldn't this be unfair to cis women competing in that sport? So
again, first off, when we look at end performance results, what we see is trans women racking up a grand total of 1 NCAA championship and 0 Olympic championships and 2 whole fighters in all of MMA. So right there, thus far, I mean, they just haven't been uh, outperforming cis athletes. They haven't
Right.
been doing badly, but I don't think it should be a requirement that they perform universally far worse than cis women, right? Because that's not fairness, is it? that's that's just another double standard.
Okay.
So
So what about my hypothetical doomsday scenario? And it's a totally hypothetical that 5 years from now we have hundreds and hundreds of trans women competing in sport, just destroying the cis women. Because this is the Tucker Carlson narrative. They're coming for you, and they're coming for your daughters, and you're going to drive your daughters
yeah,
out of sport.
yep, and that is, oh damn, now I've got to bust out the F word. That is fascist rhetoric 101. The minority group is a dire threat to the women and children. But yeah, let's say that all of this is bullshit. Right? In fact, trans women have been secretly winning all of the competitions and just not. I don't know. We'll pretend. And starting tomorrow, all of those worst case scenarios come true. That that trans women have a substantial advantage against cis women. And let's look back at those boxers, those southpaws. Now, we notice that being a southpaw is a substantial advantage in boxing. Right? Again, a 70% increase in representation compared to the general population. Let's say that trans women are way, way more advantaged than that. Let's say that they're triple their representation in the general population. They're so advantaged that they are 3 times more likely than a cis woman to win any given athletic contest. I'm pretty sure that's well beyond the advantage that cis men enjoy over cis women. So we'll say that trans women are actually ultra athletes. They are the Ubermenschen after all. So
Okay.
so they're competing now. They are representing now a whopping 1 to 3% of female athletes. So if in this worst case scenario, the transgender athletes will have displaced still only an absolute upward of 3% of cis women. And to decide that that's unacceptable really relies on a belief that certain kinds of people are just inherently more deserving or worthy than others. Right? Because you have, in order to decide that a couple of percent inclusion of trans women is a threat to cis women, you have to assume that cis women by default deserve the place, and trans women should only be allowed it at, well, if it's somehow to the advantage of cis women. So there's no way for that argument to hold up without relying on just basic transphobia at some level.
Okay. So what division do you compete in, Erin?
So I've only competed once since I've began this medical process. I got armbarred, but I did pretty damn well considering I competed against someone who got their black belt like the year I started. But thus far I've only competed against men, and honestly, I'm probably going to just quit competing altogether, specifically to avoid this whole minefield.
No.
Especially since taking myself out of the equation kind of takes some more ammo out of people's arsenal to say that, well, I'm just preaching this out of self-interest, which I will say sucks. I'm not a huge competitor, but I like doing it some. I like having that option and knowing that there's not really an adequate place for me. It certainly kind of blows. And that's ultimately what trans women in sports feel, what their motivation is behind wanting to compete in women's sports. Just like cis women, they aren't competing in women's divisions for a competitive edge, because that's not what women's sports were made for to begin with. They were made to get them out of men's spaces. But trans and cis women alike want to compete in women's sports when sports are separated by gender, because that's where we're told that women go. And people just want to fit in among their peers.
I suppose, especially if jiu-jitsu is so central to your life, pre and post transition, that saying, that not feeling like there's a place for you must be really quite alienating.
Yes. I expect that just this alone is going to have a pretty substantially poor impact on my gym, for sure.
Has it had a poor impact thus far?
Not yet.
It's hard to say because we're in the middle of COVID too.
Yep. And I've been so far very selective about how I've been presenting in jiu-jitsu. So when I did that competition a few months back, at that time, I could still stealth it very well in a rash guard. And I've been selective about who I've been out to in the jiu-jitsu community. And I was actually planning on postponing a more comprehensive coming out for a while yet, but given the dearth of honest transgender voices in this topic, I couldn't turn down an opportunity to provide one. So yeah, it's only just now that I've sort of opened up to the whole gym. So we're going to have to see how that goes, which is a relief, don't get me wrong, because bouncing my presentation back and forth and walking into the gym going, oh, crap, did I remember to change my clothes before I left? Is definitely a level of stress that I don't need. But yeah, given that I live in a more conservative area in a combat sport of all things, it's a bit concerning.
Yeah, I mean it's a micro version of things that are concerning at a larger level as well. I mean, I appreciate not wanting to stir the pot right now when there's so much hysteria on this topic, and when there's certainly legislation, especially in the United States, but this shit's going to come to Canada as well.
Oh yeah.
Probably. I mean, what do you see happening in the next year, sort of on a legislative front in the U.S. now that, and just to contextualize it for people, Roe versus Wade just got overturned. There's been a whole bunch of other very conservative decisions, but they haven't begun going after the legislation that protects, say, gay marriage, and that is expected to be coming.
It's coming down the pipeline, and the use of the Dobbs decision to justify anti-LGBT legislation, especially anti-trans legislation, has already begun. In fact, just last week in Alabama, which
so it's a legal challenge there with the plan to elevate it to the Supreme Court eventually?
No, they had a law making it a felony to provide transgender medical care to minors. That law was temporarily blocked by a Supreme Court injunction, and the governor of Alabama just last week petitioned the court to release that injunction on the grounds of the Dobbs decision because, well, citing the same verbiage. And that gets us back to that FINA rule that kind of kicked off this whole conversation. Because when you posted about it, you posted something along the lines of about, or at least implying that, well, here's a pretty fair and balanced decision, so let's just go ahead and move on. And from my perspective, from the perspective of reality, I guess, that's a pretty brutally unfair and outright discriminatory decision, disguised as a very reasonable one, so that someone who doesn't have a whole lot of education on this topic, and I can't expect most people to, right? We can't all be experts on every possible issue. So to even a well-educated layperson, they'll look at that FINA rule and say, well, yeah, that seems about right. So for anyone who doesn't know, the organization for major international swimming competition, obviously in light of Leah Thomas's performance, changed their rules so that now trans women can only compete in their correct divisions if they've received a medical transition at about the age of 12. Age 12 is the age they cite, but basically you can only compete now as a transgender woman if you have transitioned starting at Tannery stage 2, meaning the very beginning of puberty, which is the earliest that any doctor will ever prescribe a puberty suppressor, which is a very safe drug, and we could get into that too. But when you combine that with the fact that first, it's already the very lucky few who are able to access those medications, right? Unlike what's presented in all the anti-SJW outlets, trans kids are not being pushed into a medical transition. Jesus Christ. For the average trans kid, it is a massive uphill battle trying to get like any kind of support, especially parental support, in their trans identity. Most trans kids are terrified of coming out for fear of violence and homelessness, which is why trans youth does have a pretty elevated rate of homelessness and abuse and suicide and murder. It takes a whole lot of things going very, very well for a child to be able to start to take control of their bodies at that age. And it's done in an extraordinary safe way. These puberty suppressors are mainly used for cisgender kids for precocious puberty, meaning their puberty has started earlier than is typical. And usually these medications are given when doctors are concerned that puberty is going to cause their growth plates to close prematurely and prevent them from reaching their maximum height potential.
So if a girl starts going through puberty at age 8, but the parents and her don't want the kid to be 4 foot tall, they'll put that kid on puberty suppressors and allow her to keep on growing till age 12 or 13 or whatever, and then they take them off, and then she grows to a more normal height. Do I have that correct?
That's exactly right. And that's how we know that these are actually very safe medications, and that's why no one's concerned about giving them to cisgender kids.
So
because
now,
we've
if I'm a 10-year-old boy and I decide that I really should be a girl, the puberty suppressor buys me some time, because I've said this before. Like, uh, I have an advantage. I would probably be able to pass more convincingly as a woman if I was to transition, if I transitioned at age 10, or at least not gone through puberty, as compared to now. Right? I mean, I'm 6'2", and I've got this Neanderthal brow, and uh, you know,
absolutely. I mean, might still be 6'2", but
yeah.
yeah, you would have skipped an androgenic puberty almost entirely. The medications aren't administered until puberty has already begun, but it is given fairly early on in that process. Basically, they wait until you're already producing your reproductive cells, and that's a fail-safe to make sure that no one's fertility isn't any threat, which it is not.
So now, let's say I go on puberty suppressants at 10 years old because I think I want to be a girl. And then when I'm 16, I go, that was a phase. I was wrong. I think on the balance, I want to go through life as a male. I would just come off the puberty suppressants and go through a normal androgenic puberty. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that represents about 2% of cases.
Sure. But in any case, it buys time.
The very thing that the anti-trans crowd is arguing about, that kids are too young to be making these decisions, well, that's exactly what these medications are for. And just like giving these medications during precocious puberty can also prevent psychological strain on a child who isn't ready to go through those bodily changes.
Right.
And the same thing is true for trans kids who aren't ready to allow their bodies to change that way. And when after completing that course of puberty suppressors, which slow puberty down by about 95%, after that course, 98% then choose to go on to cross-sex hormone replacement. Only 2% opt not to, and they have no ill effects. So when we look at these trans laws, because now, in addition to about a dozen states banning transgender athletes, and that's even if the league allows, right? If a particular athletic organization chooses internally to allow trans girls to compete with cis girls, that's now illegal in about a dozen states. And some states are even allowing some severe civil liabilities similar to the whole Texas abortion bounties.
Yeah.
So when you compare that,
I mean, a lot of this is about punishment, like
yes,
not having sex education, not having teaching about birth control is about, if you are going to have sex, then God damn it, you're going to have a baby and you're going to ruin your life. And if you're going to have sex and you get pregnant, God damn it, you're not going to be able to have an abortion or even the morning after pill. And if you catch, if we suppress, vaccines that prevent STDs, well, we want that because you should suffer for having sex. And if you're one of these trans freaks, well, you should suffer because we don't want, it is about suffering, I think. And it's about this idea of weaponizing the law to make it, to make people suffer and inflict punishment.
And weaponizing the law to enforce an established social structure. Because certain kinds of people believe that groups that they belong to are just inherently, intrinsically superior to outgroups. But that only holds up if that group identity is immutable. And if you can change something like your gender, then that disrupts that social order. And there are a lot of people in the current political climate who really want to solidify what they perceive to be a very natural hierarchy to the world, in which their groups are, of course, represented at the top. These groups go by, of course, loads and loads of names. These days, they like gender realist and race realist and alt-right. They're not so keen on their old brandings anymore of white nationalist and white supremacist and Nazi,
Bigot.
but a turd by any other name. So when you look at all of these anti-trans laws prohibiting trans girls from competing with cis girls entirely, and a growing number of laws specifically criminalizing an early gender transition. And now you look at a policy coming out that only allows women to compete if they've transitioned early, a process which is now increasingly illegal. You see how that was a very subtle win for the alt-right, and therefore a definite loss to everybody.
Maybe despite the 98% of people carrying on with a gender transition, maybe it shouldn't be called gender transition therapy when we're dealing with young teenagers. Maybe it should be called, I don't know,
gender postponement therapy? I don't know, but yeah, I think you're right.
Because that would take a lot of the wind out of the sails. Because again, Joe Sixpack thinks that what that means is loading up little Johnny with tons of estrogen when he's 8 years old, because he decided one day that just like, well, I could just transition and I could get on the Olympic team and I could crush all these women. Little Johnny can just make up his mind one day that he wants to be a girl, and they're going to go down and load him up with estrogen. And that's not what's happening.
Of course. And unfortunately, Joe Sixpack believes that because another Joe keeps telling him so.
Yeah. Which Joe would that be? Would that be one of my very least favorite Joes in the world?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
And you'll notice how the only 2 times that he's ever had a trans woman on his podcast to talk about transgender issues, he has very carefully cherry-picked women who have extraordinarily contrary views to the average transgender woman.
Well, one of them was Buck Angel, that
was a trans man,
female-to-male porn star.
That was a trans man who also has some controversial opinions on the subject for sure.
Yeah. Easier for Joe to stomach because he's big and muscular and got lots of tattoos and smokes cigars.
And the 2 that I'm specifically thinking of, the 2 trans women he's had on, not counting Eddie Izzard, who was not fully out as a trans woman at the time and was mostly there to talk about comedy and running. But when he brought 2 trans women in to talk about transgender stuff, one a long time ago was Kristen Beck, who is a full-blown nut job conspiracy theorist, like a former, I think, Navy SEAL or something. Like ancient aliens, bonkers. And the other one, more recently, was Blair White, who has carved a niche out for herself as one of the good ones.
Yeah.
So
it's like everybody needs a black friend so they can say, I'm not a racist.
And yes, and she's making a lucrative time of being that trans person for the alt-right. So very, very telling about who he carefully selected to represent or misrepresent the rest of us, for sure. And that's really the main obstacle to most of this, is that almost all of the information that the average person gets on this is either comes directly from the transphobic alt-right community, or is filtered or vetted by them.
Yeah, and fellow Canadian Dr. Jordan Peterson doesn't help the situation much either.
No, he does not. Whose name I would barely even recognize if he wasn't a regular on Rogan. Who gets to be the chief cultural influencer in this sport.
Yeah, awesome. So what we've done a lot in this podcast, I think, is try and present some information that counters the dominant narratives, right? I've tried to channel my inner redneck and give you the opportunity to do some education. As we're wrapping up here, is there any other information that you think people would find useful and might mollify them or might make them more inclusive of trans people?
So if people are genuinely curious and are up for some a bit heavier reading, looking into like the embryology of both trans and intersex people is definitely worth your time.
How would they do that?
Oh, God, I would start with if you Google gender dysphoria Bible, it will give you a fairly concise breakdown of a lot of that stuff and point to some additional reading materials as well.
Okay. Is there anything else that you'd like to say since you have the stage right now?
Just that, when it comes to LGBT inclusion and even more pertinently, transgender inclusion, the best policy for trans and cis people alike is to treat people's gender or their sexuality or any of these topics the same way that we do for cis or heterosexual people. And that's just take people's word for it. If someone relays their experience to you, don't reflexively start to defend how someone's experience that may differ from yours must be somehow invalid because it doesn't jive with your experience. We all experience 0% of humanity, right? We get one life out of I don't know how many billions of people have lived. And it's okay for our own experiences, our own perspectives, and even our own deep axiomatic beliefs to not be the central or most important in the world. If someone comes to me and says they have some particular issues regarding some sort of neurodivergence that they have, I'm just going to take their word for it and accommodate them. If someone has a physical limitation, an emotional limitation, a mental health disorder, I'm just going to accept their description of their experiences and trust that they know what they need and that accommodating them doesn't take anything away from the rest of us. It makes it better for everybody.
Well, I can't think of a better place to wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time today, Erin, and best of luck with your training and your teaching and your running a school and all the other things that you do when you're not discussing this publicly.
Thanks. All right.